Then Jesus said to the disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was squandering his property. So he summoned him and said to him, 'What is this that I hear about you? Give me an accounting of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer.' Then the manager said to himself, 'My master is taking the position away from me. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do, so that when I am dismissed as manager, people may welcome me into their homes.' So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he asked the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He answered, 100 jugs of olive oil. He said to him, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 50. Then he asked another, 'And how much do you owe?' He replied, 100 containers of wheat. He said to him, 'Take your bill and make it 80. And his master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. Whoever is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much, and whoever is dishonest is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? No slave can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." This is the word of the Lord for the people of God. Thanks be to God. A department store received a letter from a shoplifter. The letter said, "I've become a Christian, and now I find I cannot sleep because of what I've stolen from you." Enclosed is a check for $100. Down at the bottom of the letter, there was a postscript. It said, "If I find I still cannot sleep, I'll send you the rest." Truly, there's not much room in a Christian's life for dishonesty. We look at our reading from the book of Amos, and it's very clear what God's impression of people with low scruples are. He doesn't forget their deeds. That being said, it's kind of difficult to understand what Jesus is talking about in this parable we read in Luke. I mean, a surface reading of this parable, it sounds like Jesus is actually praising someone for doing a dishonest deed. Well, how can that fit in with what we know about our call and about Jesus' teaching? Well, maybe if we were able to actually have seen the look in Jesus' eyes, hear the tone in his voice when he gave this parable, understood the situations in the day-to-day lives of those that were hearing this parable, then maybe it would easier click with us. But as it is, we don't have available to us those things. However, I think if we review it, apply some principles of logic, I bet that we can see something that Jesus is driving at here that doesn't meet the eye on a superfluous reading of this parable. For one thing, Jesus doesn't just give this parable. He uses the parable as a launching pad into a moral lesson. And what is that moral lesson about? Well, let's consider some of the things that Jesus said in that moral lesson. He who is faithful in what is least is faithful also in much. And he who is unjust in what is least is unjust also in much. Jesus says no man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he'll be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon, or wealth. Now that would be a very curious moral to be driving at by starting off by praising someone for dishonest thievery, in effect. I mean, isn't thievery predominantly driven by the love of wealth? Another point to consider is that this rich man in the parable, we'll call him the employer. When he discovers that this manager that works for him has been squandering his goods, he calls him on the carpet. He not only rebukes him, but he puts him on notice. He in effect tells him he's going to be replaced, but he doesn't replace him right then and there. Now, what does that manager then go and do? He does what we read about in our parable that leaves us scratching our heads. Now, that is no secret to the employer. The employer learns what the manager has done after he has dismissed him, and yet he then commends the manager for his actions, even saying, "You acted shrewdly." Now, to us today, we hear the word shrewd. It means something a little bit different to us than the Greek word that is interpreted shrewd in this passage. We think of shrewd and we can equate it with the idea of cunning, clever. We can see how those attributes could fit a thief. But the actual word in Greek, chronomos, that was used there, doesn't convey that meaning at all. No, a better interpretation would be acted prudently, acted wisely, acted rightly. In effect, this employer was saying to his manager that his behavior in this parable was appropriate and proper. Would that make sense for the employer to tell this manager that if he had learned that after putting him on notice for squandering his goods, the manager immediately went out and did it again? That doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? Now, if the manager wasn't squandering the employer's goods in these actions that we're reading about, then what could have occurred here instead of our assumption that the manager had gone and stolen even more from the rich man? Well, it's obvious that these bills are slashed, but when the bills are slashed of the debtors, does that mean that the amounts slashed off were actually the property of the employer? We had talked in the past about how the tax collectors in Jesus' day were a despised lot. One of the reasons was because of the exorbitant amount of interest that they tacked on to what they collected so that they could make themselves rich in the process of doing their jobs. Well, this manager had a similar job. He was entrusted to collecting for his employer. And he, like the tax collector, could easily include exorbitant amounts of interest that then he could skim off the top for himself. It was a lot easier to do when you're dealing with commodities like they were, as opposed to currencies, which require stricter measurements. So what this manager was in effect doing was saying, okay, based on my situation, I need to make some sacrifices now in order to secure a better tomorrow. And so the amounts that the manager has actually reduced these bills by were the amounts that he had in mind as his cut. He forfeited his cut to secure the goodwill of these debtors. Now, with that in mind, we can now go back and see where the employer, upon learning this, could then say, "You acted wisely." We can also see how Jesus could then use him as an example in the teaching that he was making, because he wasn't praising a manager for doing something dishonest. He was praising a dishonest manager for finally turning and doing something prudent. The manager had repented from what he was doing in terms of overcharging the these debtors, and the manager was making a conscious decision to do something now that he preferred not to do in order to have better prospects for tomorrow. Now that's the point that Jesus really used this parable to demonstrate. He was in effect telling his disciples, he was saying, if you look at worldly practices, you're going to find people that are essentially godless people, but yet make wise and sound decisions on how to use what is entrusted to them for better gain or better intent for their purposes tomorrow. Now, you as my disciples, can you not do the same with what's been entrusted to you, and even to a larger degree because you have God's Spirit in your corner? Now, in our reading, Jesus refers to this gain as dishonest wealth. He's not talking about things that we have gained dishonestly. He's talking about things that we have in the here and now, which is a corrupt world, which are temporary, which have very limited value because of their temporariness. We cannot compare them to the value of those things in eternity that have been promised to us in Jesus Christ. Jesus had said to his disciples, "Behold, I send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Therefore be wise as serpents and harmless as doves." Now we get the harmless as doves part. We understand that we have a call to be morally upright. We have a call to be unspotted by the world. But what does this wise as serpents really mean? He's in effect telling us that we're to use good judgment, wisdom, and discernment to take our blessings in the here and now, whether it has to do with wealth, as in this story, or it has to do with whatever we have been blessed with, whatever has been entrusted to us in this life, and instead of using it for self-indulgence, we turn it to God's eternal interests. As Jesus has said, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Jesus is telling us to convert the treasures that have been given to us that moth and rust destroy and thieves break in and steal into something that is eternal and permanent. This story is a lot like the parable that Jesus used about the talents. Does everybody remember that parable? Now, in that story, there's a master who's going on a long trip. And so he calls his servants before him. He's got 3 of them. And he proportions his finances amongst them. He gives to the first 5 talents. He gives to the second 3 talents. And then he gives to the third 1 talent. Now, the one that had been given the 5 talents, he goes out and he increases that 100%. The one that had been given 3 talents does the very same thing. When the master returns, he has nothing but praise for these 2 servants. He says they've been faithful in what they have been given. He recognizes their resourcefulness and ingenuity in taking what had been entrusted to them and using it to create greater gains for their master's interest. And so he actually entrusts them with even more. However, it's a different story with the one servant that had the 1 talent. He wasn't interested in doing his master's bidding. He figured it'd be safe if he just tucked that 1 talent away. And when his master came back, he could give him the same talent. No harm, no foul. Didn't work out that way. When the master confronted this servant, he not only severely rebuked him, he took away his talent. He cast him out. Because that servant was thinking in terms of, well, I'll just keep it in safekeeping. That master said, you've taken what I've given you and neglected it. You've taken what I've given you and failed to put it to use for my sake. You had no interest in my interest. You were just concerned with yourself. And that's where Jesus' words come into play. He who has, to him more will be given. But he who does not have, even what he has, will be taken away. It's so easy to be entrapped by what glimmers to the eye. And time again, the New Testament holds out to us that though that's the easiest trap to fall into, we tend to succumb to it over and over and over again as opposed to avoiding it. I was just reading a history of the early church as part of a research paper that I'm putting together. And the church really took a turn in the 4th century when the Emperor Constantine came to power in Rome, and he basically lifted all of the persecutions against the church. He basically made it fashionable to be a Christian. And we often ask ourselves about, well, where did monasticism come from? These people that go out on their own. What does it have to do with Christianity in terms of you know, they're not really ministering to anybody else out there in a monastery or whatnot. Well, that actually got started as part of the response to what happened with Constantine, because when Christianity became easy, convenient, the thing to do, many Christians understood the danger that came with that easiness. And they braced themselves against it by removing themselves from the society of that day. Well, we don't remove ourselves from society. We shouldn't. We're here for a reason. But we have a responsibility to be a positive impact on our society as opposed to our society being a negative impact on us. And when we let that glimmer catch our eye and our eye twinkles with it, it's easy to succumb to those traps to waylay us from the path that Jesus would have us be on. Jesus said, he who finds his life shall lose it. In other words, he who puts his own interest first won't have much of a life. But he who loses his life for my sake shall find it. He who recognizes that true life is in Jesus Christ and putting Jesus first results in abundant life. Now. It's not just some hope for the future. It's now. Jesus said, I've come that they may have life and that they may have it abundantly. He's talking about now because life, living, isn't about existence. It's about purpose. Winston Churchill said, making a living is about giving. Making a life is about giving. How true those words are. Everybody know who Jim Carrey is? Okay, Jim Carrey's pretty popular. He's probably on the other side of his career now, but at one time, and he was one of the hottest things in Hollywood. I remember when he played the role of the Joker in one of the Batman movies, and he was paid $1 million for that role. And at that time, that was absorbent. And he's made several million since then. But Jim Carrey said this. I found this very interesting. He said, I wish everybody could be rich and famous and do everything that they've ever dreamed of. Because then they'd know it's not the answer. Then they'd know it's not the answer. C.S. Lewis said something very, very interesting that bears on our topic. He said, The Lord doesn't have a problem with our desires being too strong. His problem is with our desires being too weak. We are half-hearted creatures, fooling around with drink, with sex, with ambition, with greed, when all the while we have been offered infinite joy through Christ. It's like an ignorant child that refuses to give up playing with mud pies in the slum because he cannot comprehend the offer of a day at the beach. We're too easily pleased. Isn't that the truth? Isn't that the truth? We hear those. We recognize wisdom in them, and yet we're so quick to follow that carrot. Wanting that money. Billy Sunday. Everybody know who Billy Sunday was? He was an early preacher in the 20th century. And Billy Sunday said something very, very interesting. He said, "A man who has no money is poor. A man who has nothing but money is poorer still." It's true, isn't it? It's very true. Because, as Ralph Waldo Emerson says, sometimes money costs too much. Now that's exactly what Paul was saying to Timothy in his first letter to Timothy, when he said, "The love of money is the root of all evil, which while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows." He went on to say to Timothy, he said, "Command those that are rich in this present age not to be haughty, nor to put their trust in uncertain riches, but in the living God who gives us richly all things to enjoy. Let them do good that they be rich in good works, ready to give, willing to share, storing up for themselves a good foundation for the time to come, that they may lay hold on eternal life." Let me read you a story. This is a Christmas story, but it really rings home in what we're talking about here. A small white envelope stuck among the branches of our Christmas tree has peeked through the branches of our tree for the past 10 years or so. It all began because my husband, Mike, hated Christmas. Oh no, not the true meaning of Christmas, but the overspending, the frantic running around at the last minute, the gifts given in desperation. Knowing that he felt that way, I decided to do something different. Our son Kevin was wrestling at the junior high school. Shortly before Christmas, his team played a team sponsored by an inner-city church. These youngsters, dressed in sneakers so ragged that shoestrings seemed to be the only thing holding them together, were a sharp contrast to our boys in their spiffy blue and gold uniforms and sparkling new wrestling shoes. As the match began, I was alarmed to see that the other team's boys were wrestling without headgear. It was a luxury they obviously could not afford. We ended up walloping them. As each boy got up from the mat, he swaggered in his tatters with false bravado, a kind of street pride that couldn't acknowledge defeat. Mike shook his head sadly. "I wish just one of them could have won," he said. "They have a lot of potential, but losing like this could take the heart right out of them." That afternoon, I went to a local sporting goods store and bought an assortment of wrestling headgear and shoes and sent them anonymously to the inner-city church. On Christmas Eve, I placed an envelope on the tree with a note telling Mike what I had done as my gift to him. His smile was the brightest thing that Christmas. Each Christmas after that, I sent Mike's gift money to a different group. One year sending a group of youngsters with mental disabilities to a hockey game. Another year giving a check to elderly brothers whose home had burned down the week before Christmas. We lost Mike to cancer. When Christmas rolled around, I was so wrapped up in grief that I barely got the tree up. But on Christmas Eve, I placed an envelope on the tree, and in the morning it was joined by 3 more. Each of our children had placed an envelope on the tree for their dad. Isn't that a wonderful story? Isn't that a wonderful story? What do we place in our envelope for our Father? Now, as I say that, it sounds like I'm focused on money. Indeed, I have used money to try to illustrate the point here, but there's so much more to the point than money or possessions. Did you realize that the word we use today, talent, actually stems from that parable about the talents? It means something entrusted to us. Entrusted to us not for self-indulgence, but entrusted for us to do our Master's will. The theme of this story, this sermon, is our need to recognize what God has entrusted us with and use it for His ends, way above our own. What do we have that we're entrusted with? Many might be questioning that. Well, I can tell you this. I can't tell you everything you've been entrusted with, but I do know this. You got it. You got it. 1 Corinthians 12:7. To each has been given a manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. Peter said, as each one has received a gift, minister it to one another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. We have all been blessed for the purpose of blessing. Jim Parker was a retired school superintendent. He and his wife Linda went on a 17-month tour of the United States, visiting every one of the 34 blood service regions that the Red Cross administrates. And at each one, they gave at least 1 pint of blood. Now, that became news, and when they were interviewed, they were asked, wasn't that a rather painful process to go through? Linda says, well, pinch yourself real hard. It didn't hurt as much as that pinch does. Now, it was estimated that 130 people's lives could have been saved by what they did. Now, if you were to ask them why they did it, their answer would be something along these lines. Well, we're followers of Christ, and Christ gave His blood for people. Why shouldn't we? Well, maybe you can't give blood. Maybe you can't give blood. I know one thing that everybody in this congregation can do. They can give a wonderful greeting, a wonderful, warm smile that doesn't just emanate from the mouth, but from the eyes. And if that's your only talent, don't hide it under a basket. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. That's the point. That's the point. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.